Dark Side of the Ring returned this week, opening its 4th season with an episode on Chris Candido and Tammy Sytch. And I thought it was excellent. Very emotional stuff with Chris. We had Jim Cornette, Lance Storm, and Dr. Tom Pritchard, and Chris's brother Johnny all breaking down at one point when they talked about Chris's death. Because it was just so shocking and so tragic the way it happened. Chris Jericho is back as the narrator for this season. Mick Foley, who narrated the Bruiser Brody episode in the first season, he was also interviewed, as was Terry Runnels, and Chris Candido's mom, Peggy. And because, on advice of her lawyers, we were told, Tammy Sytch did not sit for an interview with the producers. I mean, that might be hard. I don't know how much time they give you behind the glass when you go visit somebody in fucking jail, but on advice of her lawyers, she did not speak to the producers. We got portions, though, of 2 shoot interviews that she did. One in 2006 and another one in 2020, spliced in with subtitles. So we didn't see her, but we heard her voice on this show. I like that they kept the focus primarily on Chris, who a lot of people probably don't know too much about. And you know there are a lot of people watching this show who don't even know who he is at all. As compared to Tammy, who is a complete train wreck. And everybody knows what an embarrassment she turned out to be. So I like that they kept the focus on Chris to let people know who he is and let him know, or let us know, more about his story. There was an interview with one of the producers where they said they considered making this a 2-part episode with more of a focus on Tammy in the second episode. But between her issues and her lawyers constantly butting in and getting involved and trying to protect what was left of her image, they decided against it. Forget a 2-parter. They could have gotten an entire season's worth of material out of Tammy alone. You could have made season 4 the season of Tammy Sytch. So, Chris Candido, he was a hardcore wrestling fan. He was a wrestling geek, like many of us, from a very young age. He even started his own wrestling promotion when he was 12 years old, for him and his friends. And this, they did not mention any of this in the episode, but that is how he and Bam Bam Bigelow became friends. They knew each other from Spring Lake in New Jersey, where Chris lived, and Bam Bam lived in Asbury Park. But Bam Bam would help set up the ring. They got the ring from the Monster Factory. They would set it up, I guess, in Chris's backyard. Bam Bam even wrestled his first match for Chris's promotion. Balls Mahoney was part of that crew. He grew up a few blocks away from Candido and his brother. His brother Johnny showed off the belt that Chris made for the promotion. It looks better than the new belt they gifted to Roman Reigns on SmackDown this week. Chris met Tammy after he spotted her in the front row at a show that he was wrestling on. At the time she was in high school, they started dating. So now he had 2 obsessions, pro wrestling and Tammy. And his mother thought that Tammy was a very nice girl at the beginning when he first met her. From there, Chris ended up working in Smokey Mountain. That's where Jim Cornette met Tammy for the first time. Well, he met both of them for the first time, but he met Tammy, who had no interest in getting into the business. But he saw that she had some charisma. And clearly she was a beautiful girl. And he came up with the idea to make her a manager. So that way he could justify paying them both, because otherwise it wouldn't have made sense for them to move from New Jersey all the way to Tennessee for what they were going to be making. He says, I'll pay this girl, but she can't wrestle, so let's try to make her a manager. And they played audio from Tammy in 2020 talking about how wrestling was Chris's thing and she wanted to be a plastic surgeon and just fell ass backwards into the wrestling business. Actually, she was pre-med and she was on her way to medical school before the 2 of them got hired by WWE. So at that point, she quit school to go out on the road. You know, a few years after she went into the WWE Hall of Fame, she talked about going back to school to finish her undergrad at NYU. She wanted to become a physician's assistant so that she could practice medicine and write prescriptions. What a fucking disaster that would have been. Can you imagine? Tammy Sytch being able to write prescriptions and being around pills all the time. Yeah, that would have ended great. So Cornette talked about Tennessee being a very ruby red, let's say, Republican area, and everybody hating the Clintons at the time. So to piss them off, he gave Tammy the character of a woman from New England who idolized Hillary Clinton. And that first promo she ever did, and they played part of it, the first promo she ever did, he said she nailed it in one take. She was a natural. She wasn't afraid of getting people to hate her. She wasn't afraid of getting heat. Tammy ended up getting more over than Chris did. Even though Chris was a hell of a worker, I mean, he didn't have the kind of charisma that Tammy had, or the other assets that she had, which is what got them their first gig in WWE, as the Bodydonnas. They were two fitness gurus, which was a terrible gimmick in a long line of terrible gimmicks that Vince McMahon came up with during what I call his acid trip of 1995. So Chris dropped out of school to go to WWE because that was always his dream. He dreamed of becoming a world champion in WWE. He was never going to be the world champion, though, as a Bodydonna. That dream died the moment he got saddled with that gimmick. That dream was dead. And they had him also do a storyline where he lost to Barry Horowitz, who was the perennial jobber to the stars. At that point, there was no chance that Chris Candido was ever going to be seen as any sort of main event level star in this company. He had no chance. And his size probably would have worked against him anyway. But even if you point to like Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels, they were never the biggest guys, but they became world champion. Yeah, but they were never saddled with a rotten mid-card gimmick like he was. So Terry Runnels talked about Sunny being the most downloaded female on AOL. Oh, she wasn't just the most downloaded female. That's underselling it. She was the most downloaded celebrity on the internet in 1996. That's according to America Online. Now, I know we have some people listening to this wondering, what's America Online? You people will never know the struggle of sitting here waiting 5 minutes for a single picture to download, pixel by pixel, until your mother picks up the phone to make a phone call and knocks you off the internet, and then you have to start all over again. And that noise, that dial-up noise, every time you would dial up, it sounded like a cat being mutilated. But they showed Sunny in the 90 playing pool, and I remember the pictures of Sunny in the American flag bikini rollerblading down the beach, the Raw magazine photos of Sunny wearing barely anything. It's not hard to see why this woman was so over. Meanwhile, Skip and Zip, they were barely employed. Skip and Zip, by this point, they were paired up as the Bodydonnas as Sunny was managing them. Zip was Dr. Tom, with a shaved head. They did win the tag team titles from the Godwins on the WrestleMania 12 pre-show, and that ended up being their big claim to fame in WWE. But Tammy came along at just the right time. Lance Storm said it here in the episode with the internet boom. She came along at just the right time. She took off. And then she got caught up in the party lifestyle on the road and with people she started hanging out with who were a bad influence on her, namely Shawn Michaels. Tammy says that she started seeing Shawn after she and Chris split up, but I have my doubts about that. It was an open secret in the locker room that Shawn Michaels and Sunny were fucking. There's even stories of Vince McMahon letting Shawn use his office at some of the buildings for the two of them to take care of business. Everyone knew about it. Everybody except Chris, apparently. I find that very hard to believe, that all of these people knew, and he didn't. So he probably did. But he didn't do anything about it because it was Shawn Michaels. He was the WWE champion at the time, the biggest star in the company. He was part of the clique. He knew that it would be career suicide if he did anything to him. And his goal was to be a big star in WWE. That's not going to happen if you beat up Shawn Michaels or if you threaten Shawn Michaels. So he just let it happen. And he probably lost a lot of respect from the other wrestlers because of that. Like, how can you let something like that go on? Right under your nose. And that was very unfair to Chris. It put him in a very difficult position. Terry said being loved by the top guy felt better to her than being loved by her boyfriend who was way down here. So then Chris breaks his neck in a match at Madison Square Garden, and he winds up hooked on pills. He's hooked on somas. And this is a guy who didn't even drink in a business where all you ever hear about from back in the day are drinking stories. It was like a rite of passage. Didn't drink, didn't do drugs. He ends up hooked on pills. And then ends up leaving and going to ECW, and he got over well in ECW without the dumb gimmick. They showed highlights of him giving Lance Storm his finish, which was a powerbomb from the top rope. He called it the Blonde Bombshell, named after Tammy. And he said they were... Lance said they were taking these moves every night. Candido would give him the blonde bombshell. Sometimes he would give Candido the blonde bombshell. It's brutal. I mean, you see their heads bouncing off the mat every time. It's the thing that stands out to me the most about that opening match at the Survivor Series in 1995. Candido took the blonde bombshell from Marty Jannetty. And I had never seen a powerbomb off the top rope before. I had seen Diesel give the powerbomb, and Sid and Vader, but never from the top rope. That was crazy to me. Tammy ends up at ECW with Chris, and they're both spiraling out of control at this point as far as their drug use. So Paul Heyman does what any scummy, carny promoter would do. He decides to exploit it. And he has Tammy do this tell-all video, and they showed part of it here, talking about her drug use and crying on camera, and you can hear Heyman directing in the background, like after Tammy says, I hoped I just wouldn't wake up the next morning. And you hear Heyman go, oh, tell us more about that. Describe the feeling for us. But when Chris and Tammy were suspended from ECW, and I think it may have been a storyline suspension, but they were off television, Heyman gave them office jobs to keep them on payroll, and Chris also just wanted to help. A lot of the ECW talent, you've heard them tell stories over the years, Taz and Bubba Ray Dudley, Tommy Dreamer, they did other jobs behind the scenes. You know, Taz, I think, was helping with merchandise and t-shirts. So they were all trying to pitch in and do what they could to help ECW, and Chris wanted to do the same thing. So Heyman gave them office jobs, and their job was to front the money on their own credit card to book flights for the wrestlers, and then Heyman would pay them back in cash. And that went on for a while, until one day the cash stopped coming. Heyman stopped paying them because the company was in trouble financially, so Heyman just stopped reimbursing them. They ended up in so much debt because of this. They had to sell their house, and his credit was destroyed. Candido talked about this years ago. He was left $170,000 in debt on his American Express card and had to sell his house to pay it back because he was being sued by the credit card company. And then, in case that wasn't scummy enough, Heyman wouldn't let Chris and Tammy out of their contracts to go work for WCW so they could actually make money unless they signed papers barring them from suing him for the money that he owed them. So he would let them go, but, you know, the 170 grand or whatever it was, you got to let that go. So Chris signed the papers because what choice did he have? He had to make money. This episode did not paint Paul Heyman in a good light at all. He screwed over a lot of people, but it kind of reminds me of the Kimona story. Remember Kimona Wanalea? They had a show that had technical problems, and I think the ring broke, and Paul Heyman was afraid the fans in the building were going to riot. They were in the ECW arena. So he told Kimona, go do a striptease for them. And she agreed to do it so long as the footage never aired on television. And then Heyman ended up airing it on one of their VHS tapes, and it ended up in commercials on television for years and years, until the very end, I think. I remember those commercials. It was the night that Kimona danced atop the ECW arena, and they show footage of her dancing. I think she quit the company over that when she found out that Heyman was selling tapes and, you know, she wasn't seeing any money out of it. But there's plenty of other Paul Heyman stories. I mean, Tommy Dreamer nearly murdering him on live television at WrestleMania 17 and then turning the gun on himself. That is still the craziest story that I ever heard. He had so much, at one point, animosity towards Paul Heyman because Heyman screwed his parents over. And he was so out of his mind that for days, maybe weeks, he was contemplating showing up at WrestleMania X7 because Paul Heyman was doing commentary. He had just joined the company. He was doing announcing with Jim Ross that night. It's still looked at to this day as maybe the greatest WrestleMania of all time. And imagine if Tommy Dreamer had gone through with this plan. His plan was to get down to that ringside area through the crowd right behind where the announcers were sitting and pop Heyman right in the head from behind. Just whack him from behind. One gunshot. And then he was going to turn the gun on himself. You think the Benoit stuff was bad? Bad black eye for the wrestling business? Imagine if that would have happened on live television. Anyway, Chris finally kicks his addiction. He turns his life around. He got himself back in shape. He ends up in TNA. And then he suffered a horrific ankle injury that ultimately killed him. It was 6 sides of steel at lockdown. It was Candido and Lance Archer against Apollo and Sonny Siaki. Now, there's a cameraman inside the ring with them, inside the cage. And Candido takes a bump off a dropkick. He tries to avoid colliding with the cameraman on the way down. He doesn't want to hurt the cameraman. So he bumps away from him. And in doing so, his foot gets caught underneath his leg. And he snaps his ankle. Technically, it was a dislocated ankle. He broke his fibula and his tibia. It was a very nasty injury, and he realized instantly he could not stand up, so he tagged out. And they take him to the hospital, and he told his brother he was embarrassed to have had to leave the match. That was all he was concerned about. This man could not even stand. His leg was snapped, and all he felt was embarrassment that he didn't finish the match. So he underwent surgery. 2 days after this gruesome injury, he shows up at the tapings, and he does a promo. Then he boards a flight home, gets home. He's talking to his mother on the phone. He tells his mother, "I'm not really feeling well." And his mother tells him, "You probably shouldn't have flown home," which is what they tell people after they've had surgery. You really should not fly right away because you could develop blood clots. That's what I was worried about after I hurt my knee a few years ago. I just wanted to get home, though. So I flew home anyway, which was probably stupid. But she said that was the last time she spoke to him. And his brother said, look, he sounded fine on the phone the night before when I talked to him. The next morning, he gets a phone call that Chris is in the hospital. And by the time he got there and he saw him, he grabbed his hand. He's trying to get him to open his eyes. And he realizes that the blood isn't pumping. He's already gone. And at that point, in telling the story, Johnny had to take a break. Lance Storm broke down crying. Dr. Tom broke down crying. He could barely speak. It was heartbreaking to watch, but you can tell how much this man meant to these people. The doctors told Tammy that what happened is after the surgery, a blood clot formed in his ankle, and it went to his lungs, which caused him to get pneumonia, and then it went to his heart. And at that point, there was nothing that could be done. Listening to Chris's mom talk about how she felt she let her son down, that was awful. It's awful that she feels that way. She said that she should have been there for him after the surgery, not let him go through it by himself. Maybe if I would have done this, maybe if I would have said that. I mean, that sounds pretty normal, pretty typical, I think, in a situation like this to have that sort of guilt. But, it's not her fault. Back to Cornette, who's talking through tears like I haven't seen since the episode they did on Owen Hart. He's talking about how here's a kid who did not do anything to anyone, who got over his problems, and a broken ankle is what killed him. It's just brutal. He says if Candido was coming up today in the business, he would be a massive star because the style has changed so much. The fans like smaller, faster guys. Terry heard Tammy once say that she has no regrets. And she wondered, how can someone say those words and actually mean them? She says the last time she spoke with Tammy was after she got out of jail. Who knows which time that was? I've lost track of how many times this woman has been behind bars. Then we got audio of Tammy laughing about having had 7 DUIs and a couple of stints in jail. And then the news about her killing someone last year when she got behind the wheel, drunk, with no license. And she got behind the wheel that night and she plowed into another car and killed somebody. She is where she belongs now. Here's hoping they lock her up and they throw away the key so she can't hurt anybody ever again. On the one hand, you have somebody in Chris Candido who fell into bad habits, wanted to change his life around, did so, and never got the second chance that he deserved. He had it unfairly taken away from him. And on the other hand, you have a woman who has no remorse for anything that she has ever done. In fact, she laughs about it. No compassion for others, no empathy, only cares about herself, and now has taken someone else's life. Fuck her. Chris Candido deserved better than Tammy Sytch. He deserved a better ending to his story. But he made more of a positive impact on people in his 33 years on this earth than Tammy has in her 50. So she goes on trial this fall on a charge of DUI manslaughter in Florida. She also has 2 civil cases pending against her in Florida stemming from that same case. and unrelated charges pending against her in the state of New Jersey. She also owes the state of Pennsylvania almost $6,000 in restitution, stemming from 4 arrests in that state between 2015 and 2016. The woman is a lost cause. Episode 2 this week covers the Magnum TA story, one of the greatest what-ifs in wrestling history, so that should be good. I'm looking forward to that.